You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
First, our conversation, which I just mentioned with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. She's with us right now from Capitol Hill on what is an important day for her and for the body as lawmakers get back together and, as I mentioned, seek progress on a border deal. And Congresswoman, we thank you for joining here. It looks like your bill, H.R. 5283, is going to get a vote right after we talk here today. The Protecting Our Communities from Failure to Secure the Border Act is what it's called here. Of course, the migrant crisis in New York is not lost on us, Congresswoman. How would it change that?
Well, look, obviously the crisis has gotten out of control, and the president unfortunately refuses to undo his executive orders. And Senator Schumer refuses to bring our Border Security Act, which passed in May, to the floor for a vote. That would end this crisis by reverting back to the policies of the previous administration that were working to stem the flow. So what I'm trying to simply do here is to prohibit federal funds from now being used to allow for our national parks to be turned into encampment. Those listening from New York City understand that Floyd Bennett Field, which was a park enjoyed by over 100,000 New Yorkers annually, is now been made a migrant encampment for roughly 2,000 to 3,000 individuals. So it's number one, inappropriate. It's wrong to take these public spaces from our citizens. And number two, it's just simply unsustainable. Look what is happening in New York right now with our mayor saying they need to do slash across the board cuts, billions of dollars that they're spending on this migrant crisis that was self-made, by the way, because of the policies of the president and then the misinterpretation of the right to shelter law by our mayor. So those two things have created this mess. We need to just stop it. People, we are a welcoming nation. We are a welcoming city. I'm the daughter of immigrants myself, but people have to follow the proper process. And the proper process, by the way, for asylum is you apply from the next safe country. We have people from over 120 countries claiming asylum at our border when we're only bordered by 2 countries. Yeah. So people are abusing the system, not to mention that 50% of those cases are denied in court, which means people are utilizing this to gain access to our country, but they don't even have legitimate claims, and they're hurting all the people that are in the system waiting, but followed the rules and have done everything right.
Well, I want to definitely talk to you about asylum law. There are a couple of very specific questions I have for you, Congresswoman. It's not lost on me, though, that you mentioned the Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, New York, on the historic registry. We understand that a lot of migrants who have been sent there got on a bus and went right back to Manhattan because there was nothing there for their families. They didn't know how to get their kids to school. Do you have the votes to pass this bill?
I do believe we have the votes, and I do believe that it will pass with a bipartisan vote, as it did in the committee earlier this month or last month. But what I'll say is this, you're right, and it's not safe for the migrants either, right? There's been significant flooding on that property. It was really devastated during Hurricane Sandy, but even during a terrible rainstorm like we had a few weeks ago, it had a foot of water. So it's not safe for anybody involved. And the reality is the mayor just has to stop doing what he's doing, and the president needs to take action to secure the border. And you mentioned, comprehensive immigration reform.
Yes.
I mean, the Republicans certainly want border security, but we're willing to work with the Democrats on more visas to make sure people can come and work legally. We do have an employment issue in our country where we have a worker shortage. This can be addressed. It could be a win-win if we do it right. But the bottom line is the process needs to be appropriate and legal. Okay, well, what's happening right now, who's benefiting? The drug cartels who are being paid thousands of dollars per person to smuggle these individuals into our southern border. We know from Doctors Without Borders, their recent report, hundreds of these individuals, in just Panama, by the way, in one month, they had been raped, women and children. So it's very dangerous, it's treacherous. People drown daily, and not daily, but regularly in Eagle Pass. Just this weekend, there were 14 people who drowned.
Well, let's talk about specifics here, Congresswoman, if we could. I'd like to ask you about asylum reform. I'd like to ask you about the parole system. These are things that our listeners are really kind of keying into now as the contours of a potential deal come together. We're hearing from Democrats in the Senate, Congresswoman, who say they are open to changing asylum law. What does that look like when we come back to it? Is it a toughening of standards for those who can express credible fear, for instance, coming from other nations? What would a change in asylum law look like to you?
Well, first of all, we need to add more judges and asylum officers to actually hear these cases and determine at the border whether they are legitimate cases or not. Because like I said, 50% of these cases are not legitimate. They get denied in court. And meanwhile, they're clogging up the system. The second thing we need to change is this last in, first out system that this administration has put in place, where somebody comes over the border, they're actually first to be heard in court as opposed to people who've been waiting in line. That's really unfair to those who have been waiting years to be able to hear their cases, and now they're being shoved further back in the line because of this mass migration from our border. Third of all, we need to enforce the law that says that you have to go to the next safe country. By that standard, only people from Mexico or Canada would be coming to the United States, and that would certainly stem the flow. People would apply from the next safe country, and then they could wait until their court date, and then they can.
Should that come with a stay in Mexico policy as well?
Well, it should if they are coming from a third country. That's what I'm trying to say. We can actually address all of it where they don't need to stay in Mexico. They would stay in the next safe country. And that's really what the Remain in Mexico was all about. It wasn't just about having people from all these countries stay on the other side of the Mexican border. It was more about staying in the next safe country and applying from there and then waiting your turn in court. So I think if we do those things and add the border security provisions, we would really shut this thing down and have a more controllable process. Remember, 10 years waiting period right now to get a court date in New York City. So adding the judges and asylum officers is a big part of it, but we also have to stem the flow at the border. And if we increase more visas...
It appears that there's some common ground on that actually, you might in fact get Democrats and Republicans together. The sticking point appears to be the parole system, as it's called, which allows essentially the president to give humanitarian exceptions to people from countries like we're seeing now, Venezuela, Cuba, and some others here. Tom Tillis said on the Senate side, of course, a Republican, asylum reform is not enough to get us to the number that we need. So what happens to the parole system?
Yeah, well, you know what? My mother was a Cuban refugee, and so I relate to those individuals from Cuba and Venezuela who are escaping socialist policies, communist policies. I think that we can certainly look. This is what happened, though. The president issued this parole, but then he didn't enforce the border law. So the idea of the parole was so the people from Venezuela can apply via parole instead of coming to the border. And that was supposed to shut down Venezuelans coming from the border, but that did not happen because he managed to keep the system, the borders open, so there's a limit to the number of parole, but then you were not enforcing the people who did not apply by parole, but then came to the border regardless, and that was the whole point of parole, was so they didn't come to the border. So you have to have enforcement, right? Any way you look at it, we need to have enforcement at the southern border. It's not just because the flow of migrants is unsustainable, it is because it is completely unsafe. We have drug cartels who are pushing drugs over the border. They are setting up shop in New York City. I just had a meeting today with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Very concerning. They intercepted 200,000 pounds of fentanyl or derivatives, and that is certainly something that we have to take seriously as we see well over 100,000 Americans dying from these drug overdoses. So there's a lot here that is a problem because of our open border. And what I would say is Republicans want to see border security. We will not give this administration more money to continue processing paperwork. We want our CBP to actually do their job, and that means keeping the border secure so we know who is coming in and out. 1.7 million individuals, aside from the 6 million that had come in and applied for asylum, have come in undetected. That is what CBP estimates. We don't know who they are, where they are, what their intentions are, and that is very concerning to me as a New York City representative in a post-9/11 world.
You are definitely passionate about this, Congresswoman, but I do want to ask you about another matter facing the Republican conference now, and that is, of course, someone from your own delegation, George Santos, the congressman from New York, who's facing, it appears, an expulsion vote at some point in the next 24 hours or so. Will Republicans expel George Santos from the House?
Well, I think the majority of Republicans will, and I think it will be a bipartisan vote. and we need 2/3 of the body to vote to expel for it to be successful. I will be voting to expel Mr. Santos. Look, we earlier this year referred it to the Ethics Committee. We've asked them to do their due diligence. They have. They issued 38 subpoenas. They talked to 40 different witnesses. They reviewed 170,000 pages of documents, and they were able to produce the evidence and determine that Mr. Santos did, in fact, use his campaign donations for personal benefit, for Botox, for a porn website, for purchase of luxury goods at Ferragamo and Hermes. And so we have to take action and remove him. Now, he will have his day in court as it relates to the criminal charges.
Right.
But in terms of being able to continue his service in Congress, we believe we have seen enough and that he does not merit to continue serving in this body, and his constituents do deserve better.
Is this a good message for Republicans right now? Is there an opportunity for you to send this message to voters to say that this is an act of responsibility and that we intend to keep that seat? Because Democrats think they're going to flip that for you in New York.
Well, I do think it is an act of responsibility. And look, the last time this happened, it was a Democrat, and it shouldn't be politicized. I mean, you have to remove an individual as a bad apple like that. He lied his way to get to Congress, and then he committed these horrific activities, an inappropriate use and illegal use, quite frankly, of his donors' money. And so we believe that by removing this bad apple, we will be better served as an institution, as a party, and his district will be able to elect someone who is not a fraud. And I do believe that Republicans can hold on to that seat. If you look what happened in Nassau County this year, they have flipped everything. They have flipped their congressional seats, they flipped their county executive, county legislature, the district attorney. So Nassau County, I have good faith that they will be able to elect another Republican. But yes, it will remain a competitive seat as it has in the past.
You don't know what he's going to say at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Have you heard from your colleague from New York about what this news conference is about?
No, I have not heard, and I guess we'll find out. Hopefully we'll be able to expel him prior to that.
Wow, what a day this is going to be. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York with us. We appreciate the time as always. Will your bill get a vote at 1:30 as we're hearing? Is that your expectation?
Yeah, the debate will begin at 2 p.m.
Got it.
And then we'll have the vote following that.
Great to see you again, Congresswoman. Thank you for the insights. Grabbing the third rail here, as they say, and that's, of course, border policy, border security, and immigration reform that appears to be the center of this grand debate over funding for Israel and for Ukraine. I'm Joe Mathieu in New York today. We'll call it a special edition of Sound On because we've got Rick Davis with us up here as well. At World Headquarters, Bloomberg Politics contributor, iconic Republican strategist, joined today by Brad Howard, Democratic strategist, former spokesperson for the Blue Dog Democrats. Great to have you both here. Thank you for joining, Brad, the conversation. And Rick, it's good to see you here in New York as we consider what's happening in Washington. There's a lot I could ask you about here, but I'm just going to start with George Santos because we were just talking about that with Nicole Malliotakis. It does appear that the Republican conference is prepared to say goodbye.
Yeah, I think the Republican conference, the Democratic conference, if there was an independent or a socialist conference, they'd all be piling on this one. Look, I mean, as Congresswoman Malliotakis pointed out, the Ethics Committee did their report, 50 pages. Congressman Guest, the chairman of that committee, a searing indictment like none we've ever seen out of the Ethics Committee. And that's what matters. It doesn't matter ultimately to the House whether or not he is prosecuted for criminal charges. That is not what they're going to vote on. They're going to vote on a massive failure to adhere to the ethics of the House of Representatives. It's a no-brainer. Anybody actually who votes against expulsion has to be questioned as to what they see as the standard.
Mm-hmm. Democrats, I'm guessing, Brad, are going to vote to expel. I know they were having fun last time keeping George Santos around, and maybe it's a game they can play with Republicans, but Democrats will vote to expel, right?
Yeah, I think for a couple of reasons here. You've got the expulsion on the merits, and I think there is some, I think, credible response from George Santos that that nothing's been proven in a court of law, and there is a concern about the precedent this sets. But this is such a unique and such an obvious violation of your oath of office and the trust you have with voters, and it's well documented. I mean, it's most people always get caught with like accounting and documents and sort of tax evasion is ultimately what gets a lot of gangsters back in the day. This is a similar situation where it is a very clear and documented long sets of evidence that he broke federal law and misused campaign contributions along the way. And so I think just the severity and the clearness of these violations, I think Democrats resoundingly understand that this is something that needs to be rejected and removed from the House of Representatives. But secondly, too, obviously this is a city of politics, and Democrats think that they can retake that seat. Tom Suozzi, who was the congressman beforehand, is the clear front runner for that seat, and he will be a great member of Congress should he win in a special election.
There's going to be a special and then a real election here, Rick. Is the conventional wisdom fair that Democrats flip that seat?
Not necessarily. I don't think we have a real handle on what this election cycle is going to look. So going backwards from the November elections in 2024, I think it's a jump ball whether Republicans can retain that seat and retain the House. When you look at the generic ballot, it's pretty dead even right now. So there's no real head fake that's empirical that tells you who's going to win. Now, no question, Democrats have to have a leg up on the special because of the embarrassing nature of the expulsion that Republicans are going to have to get over. So if they can get over that, then they can make it a competitive district.
Unbelievable stuff. Quite a moment that we're approaching here. Rick Davis with me in New York, Brad Howard in Washington. And if you're with us on YouTube, do it now. Go to YouTube, search Bloomberg Global News. Brad will keep you warm with the fireplace in his office. Well played, Brad. I'm Joe Mathieu at World Headquarters in New York. We'll have a lot more ahead as we run for the border. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As border security is debated on Capitol Hill, never mind funding Israel and Ukraine, which of course all overlap, it's a tough room today for Joe Biden. The President of the United States wakes up to hear from Jamie Dimon and Bill Ackman, both not looking forward to his reelection. Bill Ackman going even further here, kind of amazing, essentially telling him that he's peaked and must drop out of the 2024 campaign. It comes against the backdrop of new numbers from Gallup. Again, tough room. Poor marks for Biden. The headline: Middle East economy, foreign affairs. Look at this, 37% approve, 59% disapprove, unchanged from last month's ratings, which remain in the basement. So let's reassemble our panel. Rick Davis is with us, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, joined today by Brad Howard, Democratic strategist, former spokesperson for the Blue Dog Democrats, with us today on the fastest show in politics. Great to have you both here. Brad, what do you do for Joe Biden? He's asking you for your advice. He's got a list of accomplishments that he thinks should get him reelected, from infrastructure to the IRA, but these numbers have been incredibly stubborn, and the situation in Israel is not helping.
Yeah, before I get to the advice that I would give to the president, which, he doesn't call me that often, but should he?
Yeah.
But first, I just want polling is tricky for a Democratic incumbent in general, because we have a sector of our base that's never satisfied that we go far enough, right? And so there are always going to be a disapproving of the president's job performance because they didn't think he went liberal enough. They may be satisfied with some of the things he did, but they want more. For instance, Barack Obama in October 2011 was below where Joe Biden is today, and yet he resoundingly beat Mitt Romney a year later. So there's a factor of that involved here. Am I concerned about the poll numbers? Absolutely. And the president needs to go out and talk about some of these accomplishments, but not in a way that says, vote for me because I've done this. Like, touting your accomplishments builds trust with the voter. I said I would do this. I've done this. Now here's what I want to do for you if you give me another term. And I think that second part of that message, the White House has yet to address. They're prepared to attack Donald Trump, who I think is going to be the Republican nominee. I think most people do. And I think in that situation, Joe Biden can and will win. But what is Joe Biden's vision for another 4 years? And to the comment that he has peaked, I think you're seeing Joe Biden's peak right now in his career as president. He is delivering time and again. He is passing historic pieces of legislation, from infrastructure to climate change to prescription drug reforms that bring prices down for seniors that no president's been able to do before. And he's also standing with our allies abroad, defending Ukraine and Israel, barbaric attacks from either a terrorist group or an authoritarian regime. And I'm proud of the work he's doing in foreign policy to strengthen NATO and hold firm with their allies like Israel and Ukraine.
Well, let's hear from Bill Ackman then. We'll get to, speaking of peaking, here's how he put it in conversation with Bloomberg. Rick, listen.
There's actually an interesting candidate who just announced his candidacy on the Democratic side that I would say no one has heard of, a congressman named Dean Phillips. You probably have heard of him, may know him. Met with him recently. I was impressed. I think Biden's done a lot of good things, but I think his legacy will not be a good one if he is the nominee. I do think the right thing for Biden to do is to step aside and to say he's not going to run and create the opportunity for some competition of
Step aside, say he's not going to run. I've peaked. Meanwhile, Rick, Jamie Dimon is urging, he says, even liberal Democrats to back Nikki Haley. Should Joe Biden worry about what billionaires think?
No, Joe Biden shouldn't give it a second thought, but he should care about what his Democratic voters think. And they actually echo a little bit of what Bill Ackman's saying. They are not happy with his performance in office. As Brad was saying, I mean, it's a Democrat. It's hard to manage a group of voters like that. They're very, different ideologically, but they have an incumbent president, and they're putting that at risk. That Democrats alone could lose this election. No help from the independents, who, by the way, aren't also buying the Biden administration's case for reelection. So Republicans are sort of done, right? We could call it a day, and if the election were held today, Republicans will vote exactly the same way they're going to do in November, regardless of who the Republican nominee is. There's a substantial difference in how Democrats and independents see a reelection of Joe Biden, a different Democrat, or even a potential third-party entrant in this. And that's the wild card that this Biden campaign has to start to deal with. And it's basically been the campaign from nowhere, right? I mean, where are they today? What are they doing? How are they trying to help him win these constituencies back? It's their own base that, according to this Gallup poll, they don't like what he's doing in Ukraine. They don't like what he's doing in Israel. They don't like what he's doing on the economy. These are Democrats saying these things. They got to get that straight.
Today, Brad, Axios decided to take a look at Arab American and Muslim American anger over President Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Interesting numbers here. They're looking at Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, all, of course, important swing states that have sizable populations of both. The Arab American Institute estimating from its own polling, about 59% of Arab American voters supported Joe Biden in 2020. It says polling indicates a dramatic decline in recent weeks, and that would jive with what we've heard about younger voters, 18 to 34, who are upset about the loss of civilian life and Joe Biden's full-throated support for Israel. All of these, knowing how narrow divisions are and how close this election is going to be either way, all of these could be game changers. How much of a problem is this now for Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem. But I would also understand polling after crises like the one we're facing in Israel is temporary and volatile. It always is. And it will not be at this level a year from now, regardless of the situation of conflict. There may be different issues and different concerns, but you're talking the debate around the war in Israel is so emotionally charged at the moment that you kind of have to let that polling, fizzle out and then address it in the longer term. But it is a problem. But I think for all the times that Republicans accuse President Biden of not standing up to the far left elements of his party or the progressive wing of his party, which he has time and again when you look at the legislation he's passed, this is another instance where the president is standing up to the far left elements of his party and doing what he thinks is right for the American people and for the long-term national security interests of the country. And so, I think this is a tense moment in American politics on both sides of the aisle. And I think we'll continue to see how this plays out. He's got to do some work to build relationships and repair those relationships in the Muslim community and in the progressive community. But, I think before Republicans jump up and down, they're not exactly running to the Republican side where Donald Trump is proposing a national Muslim ban again.
Listen, that's a great point. I guess it becomes a story of turnout at that point. But no, these are not going to be converted to the Trump base.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Mathieu at World Headquarters in New York, joined now by Kailey Leinz at Bloomberg's bureau in Washington, D.C. Kailey, it's great to see you. We've got what could be breaking news coming here. The latest from Israel is pretty remarkable. Kailey, as negotiators go for another extension here. We're in day 6. Remember, we had a 4-day pause or truce, depending on who's talking about it, that has led to the release of dozens of hostages. We are, a couple of hours away from what would have been the end of this truce. Negotiators, including the CIA director, are in Qatar trying to see if they can push this forward once again.
Yeah, there's a lot of different players in this game right now, Joe. As you say, the Biden administration, the CIA director, the president himself have been pushing for this brief truce to last as long as possible due to humanitarian considerations. Qatar is involved. Egypt is involved. A lot of mediators trying to see if they can prolong this brief peace between Israel and Hamas, at least for another period of time, knowing, Joe, that while there have been dozens, as you say, hostages released over the last several days, there are still many more being held in Gaza, though not all of them are being held actively by Hamas, is our understanding.
Yes, right. So far, and our numbers might sound or look a little bit different because not all of the hostages were released by Hamas, but so far the group has freed 81 hostages, mainly women and children. Israel, Kailey, says they have freed 180 Palestinians who were imprisoned. But we're still talking about at least, over 100 hostages who are left, and we don't know where they all are.
Yeah, exactly. And a number of them understood to be American as well, Joe. So there is still work to be done here, and ultimately more humanitarian aid that needs to get in, not just hostages that need to get out. The question is whether or not another agreement can be made, knowing the longer this truce goes on, potentially the more opportunity it gives Hamas to regroup. And as we've had conversations on this show, as well as on Balance of Power, the humanitarian consideration, the consideration for the hostages may at some point run into conflict with Israel's strategic objectives, as Netanyahu still says they will go back to fighting until the end, until Hamas has been eliminated.
Well, let's start our conversation with Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he is director of research and foreign policy and a very reliable voice on what's happening in this part of the world. Michael, it's good to see you. Thank you. We understand negotiators are talking about potentially another 2 days. Is that realistic? Are you optimistic?
Greetings. Well, optimism isn't really a word I allow myself to feel too much about this war at the moment, because, yes, 2 days of additional relief would be great. But of course, it does, as you just pointed out, beg the question of what comes next and how long whatever comes next would last, and what kinds of constraints would be placed upon the use of force, how many Palestinians would suffer, how many Israelis would continue to suffer. So I do think there's a distinct possibility that you could imagine, if more hostages are potentially released or proposed for release, then that could certainly lead Israel to accept the burdens that Kailey just pointed out of, or the potential costs of giving Hamas a little more time to regroup. And, I'm not sure those costs are that high at this point. If Hamas has already had several days, almost a week, 2 more days may not make a big difference. So I think Israel, if it can get more hostages back, probably would be inclined to do this. And Israel's probably still refining what it wants to do militarily in the southern part of Gaza in particular, where we see there's been a debate with the United States about just what kind of force to use, whether to get close to hospitals and other such facilities, whether to use certain kinds of weapons or not. And to the extent Israel's still processing all that conflicting advice, advice from the Americans, advice from its own military leadership, desires to eliminate Hamas as much as possible, it may welcome a couple more days for planning.
Well, you say eliminating Hamas as much as possible. How much realistically is possible, as Netanyahu is promising to see this through until the very end? Are we looking at potentially indefinite conflict here?
Well, we in the United States remember well, of course, how we felt after 9/11. And at that time, the notion of seeing any al-Qaeda fighters survive our retaliation probably would have been seen as unacceptable. But we all know that 20 years later, there's still al-Qaeda out there. Most of them, of course, are people who were not in the ranks on September 11th, 2001. But some of the original supporters of that organization, we never were able to find. They could just put down their guns and blend back into a population. Depending on where they were, there might or might not ever be intelligence about what they had done to implicate themselves in that original attack or other al-Qaeda activities. Hamas is the same. You know, the leadership, the top leadership, and those who crossed the border on October 7th, presumably Israel is going to work its very hardest and be willing to take some risks and pay some serious costs to get those people. But even that group of, you know, a few hundred or into a couple thousand is going to be hard to identify with complete precision and complete thoroughness. And the other 30,000-ish Hamas fighters who at one time or another have taken up weapons for the organization, I think are going to be a human intelligence challenge that Israel can never figure out in terms of having any kind of basis to say who exactly is Hamas and who's not. So if you literally take the idea of, you know, getting rid of every single Hamas fighter to its logical conclusion, you specify a strategy for a war that cannot be won, cannot be successfully accomplished, and will cause certainly huge numbers of casualties along the way. Israel's going to have to scale back from that ambition. They're going to have to focus on leadership, on the most lethal trigger pullers, on weapons caches, training facilities, major infrastructure, major command and control capabilities. And that's going to have to be their definition of the Hamas they destroy, together with the idea of Hamas as the government for Gaza. I think most of those goals are largely within reach.
We know that Israel has been provided the names of another group of hostages due to be freed today. But Michael, I get nervous about headlines like this one that we're seeing from Hamas and a claim that the youngest of the Israeli hostages, we've been hearing a lot about it, a 10-month-old boy named Kiefer Bibas. His brother and mother, they say, are no longer alive. There was hope that those names would be in this batch provided to the Israelis today. Michael, if this turns out to be true, this is the type of headline that can change this conversation very quickly.
You're right. And we obviously always want to bear in mind the very human and individual, costs of this conflict. And any casualty is one too many. But I have to say, at a level of military and strategic analysis, I'm surprised how many hostages apparently are still alive. And I would have thought that Hamas might have been trying to deter Israel's initial airstrikes and artillery strikes by putting more of the hostages near the likely targets of those strikes. So the fact that we are still in a world where a lot of the hostages are alive, to me, is hopeful. It's a silver lining of hopefulness in what's an enormous tragedy. And there are going to still be individual tragedies, I'm afraid, as you point out.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, returning to where we began this conversation, there is effort underway to prevent potentially any tragedy from occurring for much longer, keeping the pause in fighting going, including reporting today from Bloomberg that Saudi Arabia is now in discussion with Iran about making investments into that heavily sanctioned economy in return for Iran stopping the backing of some of its proxies, avoiding this conflict spreading any further regionally. Michael, what do you think about that?
Well, that's the kind of hope we all have had for the Middle East for decades. That's always been dashed. The idea of having a two-state solution, but otherwise good governance throughout the region that allows for people to pursue prosperity and that maybe benefits from some of the richer states investing in some of the poorer states. I mean, these are kind of the dreams or the aspirations upon which a lot of Middle Eastern policy has been based for decades. But look where we are even here in 2023, where for a lot of groups, the idea of being rejectionist, the idea of impeding the progress of one's hated adversaries actually seems to matter more than the benefits of one's own future generations. What was the line? I forget, the famous adage that there's only going to be peace in the Middle East when people start loving loving their own grandchildren more than they hate their enemies, and allow that prosperity, allow that investment that you just mentioned to actually happen. But unfortunately, we saw an example this past October where Hamas, perhaps egged on by Iran, or perhaps just resourced more generally by Iran, didn't like the possibility of the Saudis and the Israelis getting along better, which would have facilitated investment in the region and greater economic cooperation in the region. And so they carried out the October 7th attacks precisely to prevent that sort of positive development.
Well, we're compelled by it, but not only by the story as such a power play potentially by Saudi Arabia, but remembering where we were a couple of weeks ago, Michael, when all the talk was about a second or third front. If the minimum is achieved here and Saudi Arabia can convince Iran or pay Iran to keep its proxies in check, and this remains a war largely between Israel and Hamas, is that not progress?
Yes, that would be excellent. I'm just doubting whether it will happen.
I got it.
I'm not challenging your contention that it would be progress. I mean, anything that turned people more towards building a peaceful, prosperous future and away from inciting violence and tearing each other down would be great. But, I don't see a lot of basis for thinking that's where Iran's headspace or mindset is right now.
And of course, this idea of how the greater region fits in and ensuring that the conflict does not spill over into other parts of it is one of the objectives of Secretary of State Antony Blinken as he makes another trip to this region. He's made multiple since October 7th when this conflict started. What happens if we don't get an extension of the truce when Blinken is there?
Yeah, I don't know. At least he would be there to try to remind the Israelis to use force more carefully in the next round. I mean, first of all, that guy's a workhorse, and I'm astounded at how hard he's been working. But secondly, I also hope that he's got time and energy to think about not just the tactical day-to-day of extending a ceasefire, but also where we're headed with this. And I'm sure there are a lot of people working for him who are thinking about that question, but I think it's time to think about using a fair amount of American leverage here to push the parties towards some kind of a durable conflict resolution strategy that they may not completely love, but that will leave the place more stable long term. What I'm basically saying is trying to work with others in the region to impose some elements of a two-state solution coming out of this rather than just wait for everyone to get to it. And I realize we can't literally impose it, but we have a lot more leverage with all parties in the region than we're often prepared to acknowledge. And I hope there's some time and attention and just, enough energy in his body for that kind of question to be addressable and not just these immediate questions of extending ceasefires.
I want to hear your reaction to something that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said. Looking beyond the immediate term here, we're talking about the minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour situation on the ground in Gaza. Listen to Secretary of State Blinken talk about the road ahead, Michael, and we'll have you respond. Here he is.
Everyone is focused on the day of what's happening in Gaza right now. But we also need to be focused at the same time, and we are in conversations with many other countries, on what I've called both the day after and the day after the day after.
What does the day after look like, Michael, when none of Israel's neighbors will accept refugees, for instance?
Well, I think that the idea of a two-stage post-conflict strategy is correct, because in the first instance, what you need to do is allow life to resume and start to create some kinds of governance structures that are not just Israel occupying Gaza, but the international community and Palestinians themselves gradually entering into some kind of greater role in at least the civilian governance of Gaza. But then longer term, I hope what he's alluding to is a two-state solution, that we somehow use this terrible tragedy and crisis as a way to make possible what wasn't before, because now at least people realize how bad things can be if we just stay stuck in negotiation paralysis, as we've been for the better part of 2 or 3 decades now. So the day after, to use his framing, is presumably when the conflict stops and you start to recover. The day after is presumably when you get to maybe it's even a 3-step process, but you get to a long-term viable Palestinian polity that can avoid violence in the future and help its own people do better.
Michael, great conversation. I'm really glad you could join us today. Let's not let too much time go by. Michael Hanlon at the Brookings Institution with Kailey in Washington. I'm Joe Mathieu in New York. This is Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.